counties, cities, they do their subdivision plats and all that gets approved at that level. But then water is a statewide thing. So the state engineer has a water conservation bureau. The Office of the State Engineer has a water conservation bureau, and they give recommendations to the local land use planners about whether or not there's enough water for this use or that use. But the state engineer does not have veto power. I mean, it's just a recommendation. So that is really part of the problem, is that the state engineer, I think, needs to have more regulatory authority over this stuff. But a lot of people say, well, the state engineer should not be making land use decisions. The land use decisions should be at a local level. And that's for the local folks to be making decisions. And so you don't want to have the tail wagging the dog is kind of how they see it. But that it's a big problem. There's been a lot of efforts to try to come up with regional water plans. There's a state water plan. So the Interstate Stream Commission, they got funding to do these regional water plans. So there's the Sangre y Cristo plan, regional water plan, which is Santa Fe County. And then there's the Middle Rio Grande, and then there's like Socorro, Sierra. But part of the problem with these regional water plans, because they were supposed to project out, they were supposed to look at their water budgets. They were supposed to look at, what's the demand, right now, what's the source of water that we have, what's the projected demand going to be, how are we going to meet our needs in the future. And so the part of the problem is that the regional water plans all kind of occurred in a vacuum. So Santa Fe said, well, we need more water, and we're going to be getting it from the farmers in Socorro. Well, the farmers in Socorro didn't have giving their water to Santa Fe and their regional water plan, so there was a problem there. So there is definitely a need for this. And, I think, look, economic development is really important in New Mexico, and New Mexico is going to grow. But how can we do it in a more, and this is an overused term, but in a more sustainable way? And, and require, rather than going off in Albuquerque and they develop all over the place, in the West Mesa, there's all these like developments and these homes, KB homes and whatever, that are now like slums after the housing bubble burst. And so they should be developing, they should be doing infill in the cities and trying to, keeping things closer rather than sprawling out. And I think that there's just, better zoning that needs to happen to sort of, to get that to work out better. And I know that in some of these efforts, there's at the law school, there's this Utton Center of Transboundary Resources, and they've tried to have a bunch of symposiums and workshops where you get the water people and the land use people together and we start talking and stuff. But it's impossible to get a lot of these developers and real estate folks to come to the table. They don't want to be regulated. It's about bottom line for them. So you get a couple of them there, but it's a big problem.
Because you need to get them.
They need to come to the table.
You can't do it without them.
Right. It's a problem. Yeah.
You were talking about how much interaction there is between like New Mexico and Texas as far as water is concerned. And I had done a little bit of reading up on Texas water laws and their ground use laws and stuff, which I think a lot of other states are thinking are really outdated, because I don't know exactly the term for this, but there's sort of this, like, as long as you're not being malicious, if you get to the water first, it's a free-for-all in Texas sort of thing. And I was wondering how that affects New Mexico, especially if there's groundwater that's being shared across the border or whatever, and what's New Mexico's attitude towards those kinds of laws and such?
I can think of, I don't know a lot about Texas's water laws. And I can think of one, I know of one area where, and it's the Lower Rio Grande, it's so Las Cruces and El Paso, and they border each other pretty much, and there's a lot of shared issues. So there's the Canantillo well field that's in El Paso that's pumping a whole lot of water, and it's impacting New Mexico a little bit. And so what they have to do is they have to change, they have these very calculated like coefficients that calculate water losses and stuff like that. So they have to change their calculations of water that gets delivered to Texas. They have to deduct from that some of the water that Texas is taking from pumping, from the groundwater pumping. So it's complicated, but that's one thing that I know of that they deal with. I don't know. I'd be surprised if there was no regulation on groundwater pumping in Texas.
Well, there's regulation, but there's just this particular law that's in place that's kind of, it's sort of a fair use sort of law.
Mhm.
If more than one entity is pumping out of the same area, let's say Joe Schmo is trying to water his crops, and there was a real case that they were talking about, and then there's like a railroad station that is pumping a lot of water to cool engines and things like that. And as long as one entity is not pumping deliberately to harm the other, if they just happen to be using a lot more water, then the other entity is out of luck.
It sounds like riparian law. So there's basically two different types of law in the United States. There's riparian law, which is reasonable use. So basically, if you have land that abuts a river, you have a certain right to that water. And so you have and it's the reasonable use doctrine, which is what that sounds like. Whereas in New Mexico, the doctrine of prior appropriation actually is based on mining law, gold mining law. Because if you were staking a claim for gold, for some gold that you had found, then it's all about priority and getting there first and establishing this stuff. And so that's how most of the West, I think California has a sort of hybrid of riparian and the doctrine of prior appropriation. But interestingly, California, as progressive as it is, does not recognize that groundwater and surface water are interconnected. Their groundwater and surface water is treated as two completely separate and independent sources of water.
I wanted to ask about the term beneficial use. That seems, at least to me, that seems really ambiguous and easily contestable. So I was wondering what constitutes beneficial use, and if anyone has ever contested that and said, oh, no,